Well, we want to further expand on this particular conversation, and we want to cross over to our city center studios where Titus Mukora, who is in charge of tax at PwC, he's actually a partner at PwC on tax, joins us live from city center studios. Many thanks, Titus, for making time to speak to us this afternoon. And really, where does this place Kenya in relation to tax reforms on the continent?
So this actually does place Kenya quite highly in terms of tax reforms. I think if you look at the region, which is sub-Saharan Africa, a lot of reforms have been undertaken by a lot of African countries, especially around getting onto electronic platforms, online platforms in respect of complying with taxes. And what we find is that the adoption rate in Kenya by taxpayers has been extremely high. And it is that adoption rate, not just the actual implementation of an IT system, but the actual adoption rate that actually places Kenya quite highly in respect of its rankings in terms of tax reform.
Interesting points there, Titus. Perhaps as much as tax compliance has been improving, we've also seen the Revenue Authority reporting missed targets in its revenue collections. What's the disconnect?
Well, I think it's it's sometimes a bit difficult because you've got to unpack the numbers there. But probably, I think maybe it starts off with maybe unrealistic revenue expectations and unrealistic budget expectations that might not be matched. And then obviously there are some unforeseen issues that arise during any fiscal year. I think we know there's some of the unforeseen issues that have arisen this year that then result in missing of targets. But yeah, so I think the way some of those targets are set may be something that we probably could have another look at.
And let's go back to the report. Perhaps what sort of sectors did well in terms of compliance, and what are some of the recommendations moving forward?
Yeah, so the report looks at a case study of a mid-sized company that's doing business in Kenya, and the same model company has been used across the world in terms of getting data in respect of tax compliance and tax payments, and this has allowed for the report to actually benchmark the exercise across different countries using the same sort of case study. In terms of what can be done going forward and some of the results of the study, I think implementing an IT systems, I think, is a trend that we're seeing globally, not only in Africa, but across the world. We're seeing that the implementation of electronic online filing is a key reform process that a lot of tax authorities are undertaking. But the next level of tax reform is around using the data derived from those electronic platforms and online filing systems, and using that data to better target companies, risk profile taxpayers, and determine which company to audit and which company not to audit. And it's that sort of second phase of using the data that's been derived from those online filing systems that is sort of the next phase that Kenya should be looking at.
And Titus, just picking off from that point you've raised, of course, tax authorities have had a challenge when it comes to compliance. And when we see a compliance rate going up by about 26%, it signals some hope, really, at the end of the day. But perhaps what were some of the underlying reasons that compliance is still a challenge? Is it a question of awareness or just tax avoidance by tax-paying or would-be taxpayer Kenyans?
Yeah. So maybe the way to answer that question is to look at different jurisdictions, and what we see that there's a very high level of tax compliance in the high-income countries. So we're talking about the European Union, talking about Canada, the US, Hong Kong. We find that there's a very high level of compliance. And I think the high level of compliance also aligns to a culture of compliance, a culture of transparency, and a culture of accountability that may exist in that economy. And you find that when you come to mid and maybe lower income societies, that culture of compliance is less entrenched amongst taxpayers as compared to some of the high income countries. So it's well and good to have an online system, to have all these technological advances, but there's also maybe a piece around taxpayer education to help increase the compliance rates amongst taxpayers within a specified economy.
All right. And finally, Titus, moving forward, what sort of reforms should we further expect in relation to tax amnesties, and also what sort of policies should be guiding matters to do with taxation for Kenya?
Okay, so there's been quite a bit of tax reform. If we look at the policy side, we've seen quite a bit of tax reform. We've seen a new VAT Act, we've seen a new Excise Act, we've seen a new Tax Procedures Act. And I think the last bit of reform, the main last bit of reform, is now the Income Tax Act, which we understand that a draft act is about to be imminently issued by the Ministry of Finance. And that's going to be sort of in the next probably 12 to 18 months going to be the key engagement with taxpayers around tax reform. So we're looking forward to that, and obviously looking forward to the engagement with the relevant ministry and other stakeholders as actually the last plank of reform from a tax policy perspective.
Many thanks there, Titus Mukora, for unpacking for us this all-important subject around the tax report. Well, that report was actually jointly conducted by PwC and the World Bank Group, just showing that Kenya has improved by 26% in tax compliance and the ease of complying with the tax authorities.